Welcome to today's deep dive into one of the most significant geopolitical crises of the 21st century, the Ukraine conflict. Understanding the roots of this conflict is essential for grasping its global consequences. Ukraine, a country of over 40 million people, sits at a critical crossroads in Eastern Europe, wedged between Russia and the European Union. This strategic location has made Ukraine a battleground for competing political, economic, and cultural forces. But it's not just about geography, it's about identity, sovereignty, and the very future of the region. Settle on your beds and get comfortable as I lull you through deep rest with this delightful piece. Kindly, do not forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you will never miss out on each other. Ukraine's story begins in its long history under Soviet rule, its difficult journey to independence, and the complex balance it has tried to maintain between Russia and the West. For centuries, Ukraine has been pulled between two opposing powers. On one side, Russia's historical influence looms large. On the other, the European Union and NATO offer a path towards integration into the West. This internal tug-of-war has defined Ukraine's political and economic struggles since its independence in 1991. But what happens when this balance tips? What happens when Ukraine's desire for a European future collides with Russia's desire to retain its sphere of influence? That's exactly where our story begins. Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991 came after decades of Russian control. The collapse of the USSR allowed Ukraine to chart its own course, but the path wasn't easy. Its leaders faced tremendous challenges in creating a stable and unified country. From the start, Ukraine struggled with political instability, systemic corruption, and a fragmented national identity. In the early years of independence, Ukraine was burdened by economic decline. The Soviet era left it with outdated industries and inefficient agriculture, and the transition to a market economy was turbulent. The state-controlled economy crumbled, and privatization led to the rise of oligarchs, wealthy businessmen, who took control of key industries like energy, steel, and media. These oligarchs held enormous power, often manipulating the political system for personal gain, which further deepened corruption in the government. Meanwhile, Ukraine faced a cultural divide. The western part of Ukraine, with its European ties, increasingly looked towards the EU and NATO, while the eastern regions, including Crimea and Donbass, had deeper cultural and historical ties to Russia. This division would be a significant factor in the years to come. As political instability and corruption ran rampant, the country's leaders struggled to maintain order, facing opposition both from pro-European movements in the West and pro-Russian sentiments in the East. Fast forward to 2004. After years of political instability, Ukraine was on the verge of another crisis: the presidential election. The incumbent, Leonid Kuchma, had already served 2 terms, and the country was gearing up for a new election. The 2 main contenders were Viktor Yanukovych, the candidate backed by Russia, and Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-Western reformist. Yanukovych, despite his widespread unpopularity in the West, was declared the winner of the election, but allegations of electoral fraud sparked mass protests. The Ukrainian people were tired of the corruption, the influence of oligarchs, and the control of their political system by external forces. The protests were massive, with people flooding the streets, particularly in Kyiv's Maidan square, to demand a fair election. These protests, known as the Orange Revolution, were a turning point in Ukraine's history. The Ukrainian people, mostly from the western and central regions, rallied for democratic change, rejecting Russia's influence in favor of a European future. The Orange Revolution wasn't just about one election. It was about the people of Ukraine taking control of their political destiny. The revolution led to the annulment of the fraudulent election results, a rerun of the presidential election, and the eventual victory of Viktor Yushchenko, who promised to move Ukraine closer to the European Union. While this was seen as a victory for democracy, it also deepened the divide within the country. The East, which favored Yanukovych, felt alienated, and tensions between the pro-Western and pro-Russian factions continued to simmer beneath the surface. Following the Orange Revolution, Ukraine faced a tough balancing act. On one hand, the desire for closer ties with the West was growing, especially in the wake of the EU's promise of future membership for Eastern European countries. But on the other hand, Ukraine could not afford to completely sever ties with Russia, which was still a major economic partner and the dominant power in the region. Ukraine's energy dependence on Russia was a key factor in maintaining this delicate balance. In the years following the Orange Revolution, Ukraine oscillated between the West and Russia. While the leadership in Kiev pushed for greater European integration, Russia was determined to keep Ukraine within its sphere of influence. This was evident in the gas crises of 2006 and 2009, where Russia used its control over gas supplies to pressure Ukraine. As Russian gas supplies were cut off, Ukraine was forced to deal with both an energy shortage and the political fallout of Russia's actions. Ukraine's leadership, whether pro-Western or pro-Russian, found it difficult to satisfy both Russia and the West. Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, was wary of Ukraine's moves towards the European Union and NATO. For Putin, Ukraine was crucial not only as an economic partner, but as part of Russia's near abroad, a zone of influence he was determined to maintain. And then, in late 2013, came a decisive moment in Ukraine's history: the Maidan protests. The catalyst for these protests was President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to reject a trade agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. This was a huge blow to Ukrainians who had been hoping for a future tied to Europe, not Russia. Protests began in November 2013 in Maidan Square in Kyiv, where students and activists demanded that the government sign the EU agreement. But these protests quickly escalated into a nationwide movement, fueled by frustration with widespread corruption and the lack of political reform in Ukraine. Yanukovych's government responded with force. Riot police used rubber bullets, tear gas, and even live ammunition against peaceful protesters, resulting in dozens of deaths and hundreds of injuries. As the violence escalated, the protests became less about the EU agreement and more about Ukraine's struggle for democracy, justice, and a future free from oligarchic rule. The Maidan protests represented a pivotal moment for Ukraine. It was no longer just about aligning with the EU. It was about rejecting a government that represented the status quo of corruption, abuse, and Russian influence. People were demanding change, and they were willing to risk everything for it. In February 2014, after weeks of violent clashes, President Yanukovych fled Kiev and sought refuge in Russia. The interim government in Ukraine, led by pro-European leaders, began pushing for reforms and greater ties with the West. Russia, however, saw this as a threat. Just days after Yanukovych's departure, Russia began its military intervention in Ukraine. The first move was the annexation of Crimea, a region of Ukraine with a large Russian-speaking population and deep historical ties to Russia. In early March 2014, Russian troops occupied Crimea, and a disputed referendum was held, in which the majority of voters allegedly chose to join Russia. The annexation of Crimea was a direct challenge to Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia justified the move by claiming it was protecting Russian-speaking citizens and securing its strategic military interests in the Black Sea. But the international community largely rejected the referendum and imposed sanctions on Russia. For Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea was a profound blow. Not only did it lose its most strategic region, but it also marked the beginning of a broader conflict that would engulf the eastern part of the country. Shortly after Crimea was annexed, pro-Russian separatist movements began to gain ground in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. These regions, with significant Russian-speaking populations, declared independence from Ukraine and formed self-declared republics. Russia's role in this separatism was undeniable. Russian troops and weapons flooded into the Donbass region, despite Russia's repeated denials of direct involvement. What followed was a brutal war that has raged to this day. Ukraine, caught in the middle, was faced with a direct military threat from Russia in the form of separatist forces backed by the Russian military. The Ukrainian army, though committed to defending its sovereignty, was ill-equipped and underprepared for a full-scale war. The war in the Donbass, which has resulted in thousands of deaths and millions of displaced people, was punctuated by ceasefires that were repeatedly violated. The Minsk agreements, which sought to establish a ceasefire, failed to stop the violence and have done little to resolve the underlying political and territorial disputes. As we've seen, Ukraine's crisis is not just about politics, it's about identity. It's about a nation caught between two powerful forces, Russia and the West. The conflict has exposed deep divisions within Ukraine, both politically and culturally. While the country has made strides towards a European future, it has also been forced to confront the reality that its ties to Russia run deep. In the next chapter, we will explore the 2022 Russian invasion, a turning point that brought the world to the brink of a new Cold War. But for now, Ukraine's future remains uncertain, caught in a struggle for sovereignty, identity, and survival. By the end of 2021, it became clear that tensions between Russia and Ukraine were reaching a boiling point. The years of conflict in eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea had created a powder keg, and many feared that a major confrontation was inevitable. What had started as localized separatist movements in the Donbass region had escalated into a full-blown standoff between Russia and Ukraine, with global implications. Throughout 2021, Russia began to amass a vast military presence along Ukraine's borders. This wasn't the first time Russia had used military buildup to assert its dominance over Ukraine, but this time the scale was different. In late 2021 and early 2022, Russia positioned an estimated 100,000 troops along Ukraine's border, accompanied by heavy artillery, tanks, and air support. The world watched in anticipation as Russia's intentions remained unclear. Was this merely a show of force, a strategic move to gain leverage in future negotiations, or was it the beginning of an outright invasion? Ukraine, with its growing ties to the West, feared that Russia was about to cross a red line. But would the West intervene? And how far would Russia go? These were the questions that loomed over Europe and the international community as the year 2022 dawned. What followed in February 2022 would change the course of history and redraw the security landscape in Europe. Throughout 2021, as the situation in eastern Ukraine remained tense, diplomatic efforts continued. The West, led by the United States and NATO, tried to engage Russia in talks to de-escalate tensions. In the background, however, Russia was preparing for something much larger. Russian President Vladimir Putin had made it clear that Ukraine's growing relationship with the West, especially the possibility of NATO membership, was unacceptable to Russia. Putin demanded that NATO halt its expansion eastward and provide written guarantees that Ukraine would never join the alliance. These demands were non-negotiable for Russia. In late 2021, Russia presented the West with a series of demands, including the withdrawal of NATO troops from Eastern Europe and a halt to NATO's military activities in the region. The West rejected these demands, citing the importance of sovereign nations deciding their own alliances. As the diplomatic channels became more strained, Russia's military buildup continued. Russia placed troops not only along Ukraine's eastern border, but also in Belarus to the north. Russia also began joint military exercises with Belarus, a longtime ally, which added to the sense of an impending invasion. The Kremlin maintained that these were merely routine military drills, but the world could see that these were preparations for something much larger. On February 24, 2022, the unthinkable happened. Russian troops, backed by tanks, artillery, and air support, launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces crossed the border from multiple points, entering from the north, east, and south. The initial wave was swift, with attacks targeting Ukraine's military infrastructure, airfields, and cities. The invasion was accompanied by a barrage of missile strikes that hit civilian areas and strategic locations in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. Russian President Vladimir Putin appeared on state television shortly before the invasion, justifying the attack with a series of claims that Ukraine was committing genocide against Russian speakers in the Donbas region, that Ukraine needed to be demilitarized and denazified, and that the Russian military was intervening to protect Russian citizens. These claims were widely debunked, and many saw them as a thinly veiled excuse for an unjustified act of aggression. The scale and speed of the invasion shocked the world. While the West had been concerned about the buildup, few had expected Russia to take such drastic action. The initial attack targeted key military sites in an attempt to decapitate the Ukrainian government and disable its defense capabilities. Ukraine, despite being caught off guard, quickly mobilized its forces. President Volodymyr Zelensky, having only assumed office a few years earlier, rose to the occasion, rallying the country and the world, with powerful speeches calling for resistance. As the invasion unfolded, it quickly became clear that this was not just a regional conflict. Russia's actions threatened the entire security architecture of Europe, drawing in multiple key players. From the moment the invasion began, NATO and the EU condemned Russia's actions. The EU announced a series of sanctions aimed at crippling Russia's economy. NATO, while offering vocal support to Ukraine, stopped short of direct military involvement, stating that the alliance would not engage in combat with Russia. However, NATO quickly moved to bolster its eastern flank, deploying troops to Poland and the Baltic states to ensure that the conflict did not spread beyond Ukraine's borders. The United States was perhaps the most vocal and active Western nation in supporting Ukraine. President Joe Biden condemned Russia's invasion, offering military and financial aid to Ukraine. The U.S. also imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia, targeting its central bank, financial institutions, and key oligarchs. Biden promised to support Ukraine as long as it takes to ensure its sovereignty and independence. Despite the international backlash, Russia found support from some key countries. Belarus, which had long been under Russia's influence, allowed Russian troops to use its territory as a staging ground for the invasion. China, while not openly supporting the invasion, expressed sympathy for Russia's concerns and called for a diplomatic solution. However, it made clear that it did not condone the use of force. Other countries, like India and Brazil, adopted a more neutral stance, calling for peaceful negotiations while maintaining economic relations with Russia. From the outset of the invasion, Russia's military strategy was clear: a rapid assault aimed at overwhelming Ukraine's defenses and forcing a quick surrender. Russia initially employed conventional warfare tactics, utilizing its superior military force, tanks, artillery, and air support to seize key cities, including Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. However, the initial push was met with unexpected resistance. Ukraine, despite its military inferiority, fiercely defended its territory. Ukrainian forces, bolstered by Western weapons and intelligence support, adopted a combination of defensive and offensive strategies. The Ukrainian military utilized guerrilla tactics, small unit operations, and the support of the civilian population to slow Russia's advance. The key to Ukraine's success early on was the leadership of President Zelensky. Despite Russian attempts to assassinate him, Zelensky remained in Kyiv, broadcasting his resolve to the Ukrainian people and the world. His leadership galvanized the Ukrainian military and citizens alike. Videos of him touring military positions, speaking with troops, and addressing the nation made him a symbol of resistance. Western countries, particularly the United States, supplied Ukraine with crucial military aid, including Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, and drones. This support proved vital in Ukraine's ability to repel Russian forces, particularly around Kiev, where the Russian military, bogged down by logistical issues and fierce Ukrainian resistance, was forced to retreat. The human cost of this invasion has been catastrophic. From the moment the first missiles struck, civilians became the primary victims. Residential buildings, hospitals, schools, and even theaters were bombed, causing widespread destruction. The conflict quickly turned into a full-scale humanitarian disaster. The United Nations reported that millions of Ukrainians were displaced, both internally and externally. As of early 2022, over 5 million refugees fled Ukraine, seeking safety in neighboring countries, especially Poland, Romania, and Hungary. The refugee crisis has been one of the largest in Europe since World War II. The Ukrainian government, along with international organizations, face significant challenges in providing shelter, food, medical aid, and security to displaced civilians. Cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Bucha became symbols of the devastation caused by Russia's war. In Mariupol, the city was effectively destroyed, and thousands of civilians were trapped without access to basic supplies. Countries around the world, including those in the EU and the US, mobilized to provide humanitarian aid. Refugees were given shelter and assistance, but the overwhelming scale of the crisis put immense pressure on these countries' resources. The invasion of Ukraine sparked global outrage, and the West wasted no time in responding. The United States, the European Union, and other allies quickly imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted Russian banks, oligarchs, and high-ranking officials. The sanctions aimed to isolate Russia from the global financial system, cutting it off from key markets and freezing assets abroad. Russia's access to global financial institutions was restricted, severely affecting its economy. Western nations, particularly the US, provided Ukraine with billions of dollars in military aid. This included cutting-edge weaponry, intelligence support, and other essential resources. The aim was not only to help Ukraine defend itself, but also to deter Russia from advancing further into Europe. The aid played a critical role in allowing Ukraine to hold its ground, particularly around Kyiv and Kharkiv. While military support was significant, Western nations also employed diplomatic measures. NATO held emergency meetings, and the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia's actions. The European Union took swift action to offer Ukraine candidate status for membership, signaling strong support for Ukraine's future integration into Europe. As we look back at the first few months of the 2022 invasion, it is clear that the stakes are higher than ever. This conflict is not just about Ukraine, it is about the future of global security, the credibility of international institutions, and the balance of power in Europe. Ukraine's resilience has stunned the world. Despite being outgunned and outmanned, the Ukrainian people and their military have fought back with extraordinary courage and determination. But the war is far from over, and the road ahead remains fraught with uncertainty. In the next chapter, we will explore the global consequences of the invasion and how the world's political landscape is shifting in response to Russia's aggression. On February 24, 2022, when Russian troops began their assault on Ukraine, the world held its breath. The invasion wasn't just a regional conflict, it was an event with global ramifications. The shockwaves of this military aggression were felt across the world, as countries scrambled to respond to the unprecedented challenge to international peace and security. In this chapter, we will explore the global reactions to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll examine how the West, Russia, China, and other key actors responded, and what those responses mean for the future of global geopolitics, security, and the international order. From sanctions and military aid to diplomatic tensions and shifting alliances, this crisis has already reshaped the global landscape. The West's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was swift, multifaceted, and unprecedented in its scope. The United States, European Union, and NATO countries stood united in condemning Russia's actions, calling it a gross violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. But condemnation alone was not enough. The West needed to take concrete action to stop Russia's advance and hold Moscow accountable. The first and most significant measure taken by the West was the imposition of severe economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted nearly every aspect of Russia's economy, aiming to cripple its financial system, isolate it from global markets, and restrict its ability to wage war. The US and EU froze Russian assets in foreign banks, effectively locking Russia out of the global financial system. Russian banks were cut off from the SWIFT international payment system, which made it nearly impossible for them to conduct cross-border transactions. This crippled Russia's ability to engage in global trade, particularly with its European and US partners. Western nations also targeted Russia's wealthy elite, the oligarchs who have long been Putin's allies. Several high-profile oligarchs had their assets frozen, their yachts and private jets seized, and their financial connections severed. These sanctions were aimed at putting pressure on the Russian elite, who had long enjoyed vast wealth through their control over key industries, to turn against Putin. One of the most critical aspects of the sanctions was their impact on Russia's energy exports. Russia's economy is heavily reliant on oil and natural gas exports, particularly to Europe. Western nations began imposing sanctions on these sectors, and the US banned imports of Russian oil, while the EU announced plans to gradually reduce its reliance on Russian energy. This move had a significant impact on global energy markets, driving up prices and creating challenges for European nations. Western countries also imposed a broad range of trade restrictions, targeting Russian industries and sectors such as aerospace, defense, technology, and manufacturing. Russia's access to advanced technologies, including semiconductors and high-tech machinery, was severely restricted, hindering its ability to maintain and modernize its military forces. The West did not stop at economic measures. NATO and the EU quickly mobilized to provide Ukraine with extensive military support. The US became Ukraine's most significant military benefactor, sending billions of dollars worth of military aid, including advanced weaponry, ammunition, and intelligence support. The aid included: one of the first military supplies to arrive in Ukraine were Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft systems. These weapons allowed Ukrainian forces to counter Russian armored vehicles and aircraft, providing crucial defensive capabilities. Western countries, including the US, supplied Ukraine with drones, such as the Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2, which proved to be highly effective in targeting Russian military assets. Drones became essential for Ukraine's defense strategy, providing real-time intelligence and precision strikes against Russian supply lines and armored units. The US and NATO provided Ukraine with critical intelligence, helping the Ukrainian military to anticipate Russian movements and counterattack more effectively. This included satellite imagery, electronic surveillance, and real-time battlefield data. NATO forces, especially from countries like the UK and Poland, provided training for Ukrainian troops, helping them to utilize Western weapon systems effectively. NATO also offered tactical support and guidance, including cyber assistance to combat Russian disinformation and military hacking efforts. Alongside these material contributions, Western nations provided unwavering diplomatic support to Ukraine. NATO and the European Union both condemned Russia's actions and expressed their solidarity with Ukraine. The European Union moved quickly to grant Ukraine candidate status, signaling its commitment to Ukraine's future in Europe, despite Russia's objections. The United Nations was another arena where the West pushed for Russia's isolation, with the General Assembly passing resolutions condemning the invasion and calling for the withdrawal of Russian forces. As expected, Russia responded to Western sanctions and military aid with defiance and countermeasures, but the invasion's impact on Russia itself has been significant. In the face of unprecedented sanctions, Russia took several steps to mitigate the economic damage. While the sanctions were devastating, Russia has historically maintained some degree of economic autonomy through its vast energy resources and financial reserves. Following the imposition of sanctions, Russia's currency, the ruble, plummeted in value. Inflation skyrocketed, and consumer goods became scarce. The Central Bank of Russia raised interest rates to stabilize the ruble, but the economic damage was already done. The inflationary pressures hit the average Russian citizen hard, reducing their standard of living and leading to widespread discontent. Russian stock markets plunged, and foreign companies pulled out of Russia in droves. The exit of multinational corporations such as McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Shell led to massive job losses and a contraction of Russia's economy. With its ties to the West severely strained, Russia sought to pivot towards China and other non-Western allies. Russia increasingly turned to China for trade and financial support, though this came with its own set of challenges, particularly as China took a more cautious stance on the invasion, balancing its economic relationship with Russia and its political ties with the West. While Putin maintained control over the country, the invasion sparked protests across Russia. Thousands of Russians took to the streets, calling for an end to the war and expressing their opposition to the government's actions. These protests were met with swift and brutal repression, as Russian police detained tens of thousands of demonstrators, and independent media outlets were silenced. Putin's domestic support remained strong in the early stages of the invasion, but the growing economic crisis and mounting casualties from the war began to take their toll. By the summer of 2022, disillusionment within Russia was palpable, even though the government continued to stoke nationalism and anti-Western sentiment to maintain public support. China, a key global power, found itself in a delicate position following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While China has historically been one of Russia's closest allies, it also has significant economic ties to Europe and the United States. China's response to the conflict was cautious and strategic, aiming to avoid taking sides while maintaining its economic and geopolitical interests. China did not immediately condemn Russia's invasion. Instead, it called for peace and dialogue, urging both sides to engage in negotiations. This cautious stance was rooted in China's desire to protect its own economic interests, as well as its broader ambition to avoid being dragged into a confrontation with the West. However, China expressed understanding of Russia's security concerns regarding NATO and the U.S. military presence near its borders. In a joint statement with Russia released just before the invasion, China reiterated its support for Russia's stance on NATO, which was viewed as a strategic alignment between the two countries. Despite its neutrality, China sought to deepen its economic ties with Russia. In the aftermath of Western sanctions, China became an essential trading partner for Russia, particularly in the energy sector. Russia began to sell more oil and gas to China, and both countries signed long-term energy contracts, increasing China's dependence on Russian resources. China's support for Russia's actions in Ukraine was framed by its own long-term interests. As China continues to assert its influence in Asia, particularly in the South China Sea and Taiwan, it viewed Russia's aggression as a demonstration of the need for greater control over its sphere of influence. By tacitly supporting Russia, China hoped to send a message to the West about its own territorial ambitions and the importance of not underestimating its global power. But China also knew that backing Russia too strongly could alienate its critical trading partners in Europe and the US, so it walked a fine line expressing sympathy for Russia while not fully endorsing the invasion. The global reactions to Russia's invasion of Ukraine have been profound and far-reaching. While the West has united in its opposition to Russia's actions, the response from other global powers, particularly China, has been more measured, focused on preserving their own strategic interests. This conflict is not just reshaping Europe's security landscape, it is shifting the very foundations of international relations. The war has underscored the limitations of diplomacy, the power of economic sanctions, and the shifting alliances that are emerging in the face of Russian aggression. The world now faces a new geopolitical reality, one in which old alliances are being tested and new global power dynamics are emerging. In the next chapter, we will delve deeper into the humanitarian impact of the war and the toll it has taken on the people of Ukraine. As the war drags on, the human cost continues to rise, and the future of Ukraine remains uncertain. Stay tuned as we explore the ongoing struggle for Ukraine's survival and the international response to the growing humanitarian crisis. While the military operations of the Russia-Ukraine war dominate the headlines, there is another, equally devastating aspect of this conflict that demands attention: the humanitarian crisis. The war has not only brought destruction to Ukrainian cities, but has also inflicted untold suffering on the Ukrainian people. Millions have been forced to flee their homes, and countless families have been torn apart. Hospitals, schools, and essential infrastructure have been destroyed, leaving entire communities without access to basic needs. In this chapter, we will examine the human cost of this conflict, the displacement of civilians, the destruction of infrastructure, and the toll on the Ukrainian population. We will also look at the broader security implications of this crisis for Ukraine, Europe, and the global community. How will the humanitarian crisis affect Ukraine's future? What are the long-term security consequences of a war that has already lasted for months, and what role can the international community play in mitigating the devastation? From the moment the first missiles struck Ukrainian soil on February 24, 2022, civilians became the primary victims. Residential areas, civilian infrastructure, hospitals, and schools were all targeted by Russian forces. Major cities such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and Odessa have borne the brunt of the invasion. These cities have been reduced to rubble, with civilian casualties mounting by the day. One of the most devastating examples of this destruction has been the siege of Mariupol, a port city in southern Ukraine. Russian forces surrounded Mariupol for weeks, cutting off supplies and bombarding the city with artillery and airstrikes. Hospitals were destroyed, and essential services like electricity, water, and heating were lost. The human toll was staggering, with thousands of civilians killed and many more injured. The city's inhabitants faced unspeakable conditions, living in basements to avoid bombings, surviving without food or water, and witnessing their homes and neighborhoods being obliterated. The true number of casualties in this conflict is hard to determine, but estimates suggest that tens of thousands of civilians have lost their lives. The United Nations reports that by mid-2022, over 10,000 civilians had been killed, with the real number likely much higher. The vast majority of these deaths were caused by indiscriminate Russian bombing campaigns targeting residential areas, infrastructure, and civilian populations. In addition to human casualties, the war has caused massive damage to Ukraine's infrastructure. Airports, train stations, roads, and bridges have been bombed, making it incredibly difficult for people to escape war zones or receive aid. The destruction of critical infrastructure has also severely hampered the ability of Ukraine to rebuild its economy and maintain its social services. Hospitals and schools, key pillars of any society, have not been spared. Medical facilities have been targeted directly, leaving people with nowhere to go for medical care. In many cases, doctors and nurses have been forced to work in makeshift hospitals, often without access to proper equipment or supplies. Meanwhile, children have been denied an education, as schools are either damaged or repurposed as shelters for displaced families. As the fighting intensified, millions of Ukrainians were forced to flee their homes. The refugee crisis has become one of the largest in Europe since World War II. According to the United Nations, by mid-2022, more than 5 million people had fled Ukraine, and that number continues to grow. The majority of Ukrainian refugees sought refuge in neighboring countries, with Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia being the primary destinations. Poland in particular has opened its borders to Ukrainians, offering them food, shelter, and medical care. In many cases, Ukrainians were allowed to stay indefinitely, and the Polish government has even provided financial assistance to help them settle. The European Union moved quickly to grant temporary protection status to Ukrainian refugees, giving them the right to live, work, and receive health care in EU countries. Other European nations, including Germany and France, have also opened their doors to Ukrainians, although challenges remain in terms of providing adequate housing, employment, and social services. While European nations have shown solidarity, the massive influx of refugees has placed a strain on neighboring countries' resources. Poland, for example, which has taken in over 2 million refugees, has seen its healthcare system overwhelmed, schools filled to capacity, and housing resources stretched thin. The UN and various humanitarian organizations have stepped in to provide aid, but the scale of the crisis continues to challenge even the most well-equipped countries. Internally, millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes and seek shelter elsewhere within the country. Cities like Kyiv, Lviv have become major hubs for displaced persons, as people from conflict zones in the east and south try to escape the violence. However, these displaced persons face limited resources, and many are living in overcrowded conditions, unable to access basic necessities. The UN estimates that over 7 million people have been displaced within Ukraine, adding another layer of complexity to an already devastating humanitarian situation. The scale of the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine has prompted an outpouring of support from the international community. Governments, international organizations, and civil society groups have mobilized to provide assistance to Ukraine's people. However, the sheer size of the crisis has made it difficult for aid organizations to keep up with the demand. The United Nations, along with international NGOs like the International Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and UNICEF, have been on the front lines of the response. These organizations have provided food, water, medical supplies, and shelter to millions of displaced people. In addition to direct assistance, the UN has also worked to coordinate evacuation efforts, setting up humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to flee the most dangerous areas, although these corridors have often been targeted by Russian forces. Despite these challenges, the work of these organizations has been critical in saving lives and alleviating suffering. In addition to humanitarian organizations, governments around the world have pledged billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine. The United States, in particular, has provided both military and humanitarian assistance. This has included food, medicine, medical equipment, and financial support to help Ukraine cope with the ongoing crisis. The European Union, too, has mobilized significant resources, providing both humanitarian assistance to refugees and financial aid to the Ukrainian government to help maintain essential services during the conflict. Despite these efforts, the delivery of aid has been fraught with challenges. Ongoing conflict, road blockages, and the deliberate targeting of humanitarian convoys by Russian forces have hindered the flow of supplies. In some areas, such as Mariupol, aid has been completely cut off, and humanitarian convoys have been forced to turn back. The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is inextricably linked to the broader security implications of the conflict. While the world focuses on the immediate toll on civilians, the security dynamics of Europe and the global order have been fundamentally altered by the invasion. Ukraine's future now hinges on its ability to defend its sovereignty. The war has brought the country to the brink of collapse, but it has also forged a united national identity. Ukrainians, who were once divided politically and culturally, are now bound by a shared sense of resistance against foreign aggression. But even as Ukraine fights to maintain its territorial integrity, it faces significant challenges. The military conflict has destabilized large portions of the country, and recovering territory lost to Russia will be a long and costly process. The ongoing war has not only decimated Ukraine's infrastructure, but also severely weakened its economy, making any future recovery an arduous task. The invasion of Ukraine has reignited concerns over Europe's security. Russia's actions have shattered the post-Cold War order, leaving European nations questioning their own security. NATO has responded by reinforcing its eastern borders, deploying additional troops to Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. NATO's efforts to protect its members from Russian aggression have intensified, and the alliance has moved closer to Ukraine's borders, offering logistical and military support. On the global stage, Russia's invasion has signaled a return to a more adversarial and competitive international system. The United States, NATO, and Russia are now at loggerheads, and the stakes are high. The war in Ukraine has sparked a renewed focus on military readiness, defense spending, and the importance of international alliances. Countries like China, India, and Turkey, who have traditionally sought to remain neutral, are now being forced to make strategic decisions about where they stand. The war has also made it clear that global security cannot be taken for granted. The vulnerability of smaller nations, particularly those on the periphery of great powers, has been exposed. As Europe grapples with the threat from Russia, the world is watching to see whether this conflict will serve as a precursor to wider global instability. As we have seen, the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is a direct result of the ongoing war, and its effects will be felt for generations to come. Millions of lives have been shattered, and the country's future hangs in the balance. The war has reshaped Europe's security landscape and altered the global order in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The international community must continue to provide humanitarian aid and support to Ukraine. But it is also clear that a lasting peace will require much more than just military and financial assistance. The war has highlighted the fragility of global peace and the need for a unified response to aggression. In the next chapter, we will explore the long-term implications of the war, the potential for peace, and the future of Ukraine in a world fundamentally changed by this devastating conflict. As the war in Ukraine enters its second year, the question that remains is, what will the future hold? For Ukraine, the war is not just a battle for territorial integrity, it's a fight for its very survival as a nation. The future of Ukraine, its sovereignty, and its place in the world are now inextricably linked to the outcome of this devastating conflict. But it's not just Ukraine's future that's at stake. This war has already reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe and beyond. The international order, once defined by relative stability and cooperation, has been rocked by Russia's aggressive actions. Global alliances are being tested, and the world is watching to see how this conflict will unfold and what kind of world will emerge from it. In this chapter, we will explore the possible outcomes of the war, the future of Ukraine in a post-war world, and the long-term geopolitical implications of the conflict. Will Ukraine emerge victorious? Can peace be negotiated? Or is a protracted war inevitable? And how will this conflict reshape the world order? The first and most pressing question for Ukraine and for the world is whether the war will be short-lived or prolonged. While some analysts initially expected a quick Russian victory, the resistance put up by Ukraine has proven to be far more formidable than anyone anticipated. Ukraine has already fought off Russian advances on Kyiv, recaptured significant territory, and has kept up its fight with the support of the West. But despite these successes, the path to a decisive victory remains unclear. There are several possible outcomes for the conflict, each with its own implications for Ukraine and the world. A prolonged war. One scenario is that the war could drag on for years. While Russia's military is large and well-equipped, its logistical problems, low morale among troops, and the fierce resistance from Ukraine have made it difficult for Russia to achieve its goals. The longer the war continues, the more entrenched the conflict will become, leading to greater destruction and loss of life. A prolonged war could also have serious political consequences for both Russia and Ukraine. In Russia, the war could become more unpopular as casualties mount and the economy continues to suffer under sanctions. However, for Ukraine, continued resistance could solidify its national identity, but it would come at a heavy cost with further civilian casualties and destruction. Another possible outcome is that both sides could eventually seek peace talks. While peace negotiations have taken place intermittently throughout the conflict, they have largely failed due to deep distrust between the parties. However, there is still the possibility that international pressure and growing war fatigue could bring both sides to the negotiating table. A peace agreement could take many forms, ranging from a formal ceasefire to a more comprehensive settlement involving territorial compromises. For Ukraine, a peace deal would likely require significant concessions, possibly involving the neutralization of Ukraine's NATO ambitions or the autonomy of the Donbas region. For Russia, a peace deal would require the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from areas like Crimea and Donbas, where Russian-backed separatists hold sway. However, given the scale of the destruction and the animosity between the parties, a peace deal could be difficult to achieve without international mediation and long-term guarantees. The most alarming potential outcome is a permanent change to Ukraine's territorial integrity. This could involve the formal annexation of Crimea and parts of the Donbas region by Russia, with Ukraine being forced to accept these losses. While this would be a devastating blow to Ukraine's sovereignty, it could also be the price for peace in the short term, as Russia would likely demand that Ukraine recognize these territorial changes as a condition of ending the conflict. Such a scenario would have far-reaching consequences for international law, security, and the future of Ukraine's relationship with the West. It could also embolden other nations to pursue territorial expansion through force, setting a dangerous precedent for global peace. Ukraine's future is also bound to its relationship with NATO and the European Union. The question of NATO membership has been a central issue throughout the conflict. Russia's opposition to NATO's expansion into Ukraine has been a key driver of the war. But what role will NATO play in Ukraine's future once the war ends? Despite Russia's objections, NATO has strongly supported Ukraine throughout the conflict. The alliance has provided Ukraine with extensive military aid and intelligence, and NATO member countries have sent troops to reinforce their eastern borders. While NATO has stopped short of intervening directly in the conflict, it has made it clear that it stands with Ukraine against Russian aggression. Once the war ends, the question of Ukraine's future membership in NATO will likely be one of the most contentious issues. While NATO has expressed support for Ukraine's eventual membership, Russia has made it clear that it sees NATO's expansion into Ukraine as a direct threat to its security. The alliance would need to navigate this delicate issue carefully, balancing its support for Ukraine with the risk of escalating tensions with Russia. The EU has been another key supporter of Ukraine during the war, providing humanitarian aid, economic support, and military assistance. Following the invasion, the EU quickly granted Ukraine candidate status, signaling its commitment to Ukraine's future integration into Europe. However, full EU membership is likely to be a long and difficult process, as Ukraine will need to undergo significant reforms to meet the EU's standards on governance, the economy, and human rights. Ukraine's integration into the EU would provide long-term benefits, including access to the European single market, political stability, and enhanced security. However, this process could take many years, and the war's aftermath may make it even harder for Ukraine to meet the necessary criteria. The political, social, and economic rebuilding required after the war will likely be immense, and the EU will need to provide substantial financial support to help Ukraine recover. The war in Ukraine has raised fundamental questions about the future of global security. For many, this conflict represents a return to the kind of geopolitical tensions seen during the Cold War, where superpowers competed for influence and used proxy wars to advance their interests. In this new Cold War, however, the stakes are much higher. The conflict in Ukraine has reignited debates about the use of force in international relations and the ability of international institutions to maintain peace. The West's support for Ukraine has led to a renewed focus on NATO and its role in global security. NATO's expansion, once seen as a positive force for peace and stability in Europe, is now viewed by Russia as a direct threat to its interests. As NATO solidifies its eastern borders, the alliance is entering a new phase of its existence, one that may involve greater military preparedness and increased tensions with Russia. The West's response to Russia's aggression has also led to discussions about the limits of Western power. While NATO's solidarity with Ukraine has been clear, the alliance's ability to deter Russia through sanctions, diplomacy, and military support remains uncertain. Will NATO's commitment to defending its member states extend to Ukraine in the future? Can the West hold the line against Russian aggression, or will the conflict lead to broader regional instability? The war has also prompted a shift in global alliances. While many Western nations have united in opposition to Russia, countries like China, India, and Turkey have maintained more neutral positions, opting for diplomacy and economic ties with Russia rather than outright condemnation. These countries are now facing pressure to take a stand on the conflict, but they are also wary of alienating Russia, with which they share economic and strategic interests. The conflict has highlighted the growing influence of non-Western powers in global affairs. China, in particular, has emerged as a key player in the geopolitical landscape, using its economic clout to position itself as a mediator while avoiding direct confrontation with Russia. The future of global diplomacy will likely involve a more multipolar world, where the US, Russia, China, and other regional powers compete for influence. As we look to the future, the question remains: what will the ultimate outcome of this conflict be? Will Ukraine emerge victorious, maintaining its sovereignty and forging closer ties with the West? Or will Russia succeed in imposing its will on Ukraine, altering the map of Europe, and undermining the principles of international law? One thing is certain: the world has already changed. The conflict in Ukraine has demonstrated the fragility of global peace and the limits of diplomacy. The future of Ukraine, Europe, and the international order hangs in the balance. For Ukraine, the road ahead is uncertain. The country will need to rebuild its infrastructure, heal its divisions, and recover from the devastating toll of war. But it also has the opportunity to forge a new identity, one grounded in independence, democracy, and European values. For the world, the war in Ukraine marks the beginning of a new era of geopolitical competition. Whether this conflict will lead to a broader confrontation or a new international order will depend on the decisions made in the coming months and years. As we conclude this chapter, we are left with one crucial question. How will this war shape the future of Europe and the world? Only time will tell, but one thing is clear: Ukraine's fight for its future is far from over. As the war in Ukraine progresses, its long-term effects are becoming clearer. This conflict is far from a mere regional dispute. It is reshaping the geopolitical order of the 21st century. Ukraine's future, both as a nation and as a member of the international community, hangs in the balance. What will become of Ukraine after the war? Will it emerge as a vibrant, stable democracy, or will it remain mired in conflict and division? Beyond Ukraine, this war is transforming global security dynamics, with implications for Europe, NATO, and international law. The war has also raised critical questions about the future of alliances, the protection of sovereignty, and the balance of power in Europe and the wider world. In this chapter, we will explore the lasting effects of the war on Ukraine and the global security architecture. How will Ukraine rebuild? What impact will the war have on global alliances? And how will the world respond to the new realities that this war has created? After the smoke clears and the fighting ends, Ukraine will face an immense task: rebuilding its war-torn country. The destruction caused by the Russian invasion is staggering. Cities, towns, and villages have been leveled, and entire regions have been left in ruins. According to the United Nations, the damage to infrastructure in Ukraine is estimated at over $500 billion, and the cost of reconstruction will only rise as the war drags on. One of the first tasks will be to rebuild Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Roads, bridges, airports, power grids, and water systems have all been severely damaged or destroyed. In cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol, entire neighborhoods have been wiped out. The challenge will be immense both financially and logistically. Ukraine will need international assistance to rebuild its infrastructure. The European Union, along with other global partners, has already pledged significant aid, but the rebuilding process will require years of effort. The question is whether Ukraine can rebuild quickly enough to restore normal life for its citizens and attract foreign investment to kickstart the economy. Ukraine's economy has been devastated by the war. Its agricultural sector, once the breadbasket of Europe, has been disrupted by the fighting. And major industries like steel and energy have been severely impacted. Much of the workforce has been displaced, and many companies have been forced to close or relocate. Recovery will require Ukraine to make substantial reforms, including tackling corruption, modernizing industries, and attracting foreign investment. The country will also need to rebuild its banking sector, which has suffered under the pressure of the war. For Ukraine to recover, it will need strong partnerships with the international community, particularly the EU and the US, who have already provided financial aid and economic assistance. The war has also created a new sense of national identity for Ukrainians. The conflict has unified the country in a way that was previously unimaginable. Ukrainians from all regions of the country have come together to defend their homeland. This shared experience of resistance against Russian aggression has transformed Ukraine into a nation-state with a clearer sense of purpose and direction. As the war winds down, this newfound unity will likely be a source of strength. Ukraine will need to maintain this sense of solidarity in the post-war era, as it faces the difficult task of healing divisions between its east and west. The trauma of war, the loss of life, and the ongoing conflict in the Donbas region will require national reconciliation efforts, both at the political and social levels. One of the most pressing questions for Ukraine is its future within the broader European and international community. Before the war, Ukraine had already expressed interest in joining both NATO and the European Union. But the war has intensified these aspirations, and Ukraine is now more determined than ever to become part of the European family. Ukraine's path to NATO membership is now one of the most significant issues facing the country. For decades, NATO membership was a key goal for Ukraine, but it was a path fraught with obstacles, particularly due to Russia's opposition. The 2022 invasion has turned NATO's support for Ukraine into a critical pillar of its defense strategy. Since the war began, NATO has provided Ukraine with military aid, intelligence, and training. However, NATO's formal membership for Ukraine has not been fully realized due to concerns about provoking Russia further. NATO's leadership has been cautious about taking Ukraine into the alliance, primarily due to the ongoing conflict and the risk of escalating tensions with Russia. After the war, however, Ukraine's chances of joining NATO will depend on several factors. First, NATO will need to assess whether it can guarantee Ukraine's security without provoking further conflict with Russia. Second, Ukraine will have to meet NATO's membership requirements, including military reforms, political stability, and institutional integration. If Ukraine succeeds in securing NATO membership, it will mark a significant shift in the security architecture of Europe. The European Union has also been a key partner for Ukraine, particularly since the 2014 Maidan revolution. The EU has provided Ukraine with financial aid, political support, and economic assistance. But Ukraine's desire to join the EU is not just about financial aid. It is about securing Ukraine's future as a stable, democratic, and prosperous nation-state. Since the war began, the EU has taken an unprecedented step, granting Ukraine official candidate status for membership. This was a powerful symbolic gesture of support, but it is only the first step in a long and difficult journey. Full EU membership requires significant political, economic, and legal reforms, including addressing corruption, strengthening democratic institutions, and aligning with EU standards in areas like the rule of law, human rights, and environmental policies. For Ukraine, EU membership is not just about economic recovery. It's about security and political stability. Ukraine's integration into the EU would provide it with access to the European single market, strengthen its political ties to Europe, and provide a safeguard against future Russian aggression. However, this process will take many years, and the road to full EU membership will be long and complex. The war in Ukraine has shattered the post-Cold War order, reshaping global security dynamics in ways that are still unfolding. The conflict has challenged the assumptions about European security and the stability of international borders. It has also raised critical questions about the future of international law and the protection of sovereignty. The war in Ukraine has reignited the era of great power competition. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not just about Ukraine's sovereignty. It's about Russia's desire to reassert its influence over its neighboring countries and challenge the global order that has been dominated by the US and NATO since the fall of the Soviet Union. For the US and its allies, the war represents a direct challenge to the rules-based international order, where borders are respected and conflicts are resolved through diplomacy, not force. The West's response to Russia's aggression has been swift and decisive, but it has also highlighted the limitations of the post-Cold War global order. In this new age of competition, countries like China and India are increasingly playing a larger role in shaping the global balance of power. For NATO, the war in Ukraine represents both a challenge and an opportunity. The alliance has responded to Russia's aggression by bolstering its eastern defenses and reaffirming its commitment to collective defense. NATO's unity has been tested, but it has emerged stronger, with countries like Finland and Sweden considering NATO membership in response to Russia's actions. The future of NATO, however, will depend on the outcome of the conflict. If Russia is able to achieve its goals in Ukraine, it may embolden other authoritarian regimes around the world to pursue their territorial ambitions. If Ukraine prevails, it will signal that the international community, led by NATO, can successfully stand up to aggression and defend the principles of sovereignty and self-determination. One of the most significant consequences of the war in Ukraine will be the shift towards a more multipolar world. The conflict has exposed deep divisions between the West and Russia, but it has also shown the growing influence of other global powers, particularly China and India. As Russia becomes more isolated from the West, it is seeking stronger ties with China, while China, in turn, is looking to balance its interests between Russia and the West. This emerging multipolarity is reshaping global alliances and power dynamics. Countries in the global South, particularly in Africa and Asia, are watching the conflict closely and determining how best to navigate this new geopolitical landscape. The future of global security will be defined not just by the US and NATO, but by a broader array of actors who are increasingly asserting their influence on the world stage. As we look to the future, the war in Ukraine will undoubtedly have far-reaching consequences. For Ukraine, the path ahead is uncertain, but the resilience and courage of its people will guide the nation through the difficult process of recovery and reconstruction. For the world, the war has demonstrated the fragility of peace and the limits of diplomacy. It has exposed the vulnerabilities of smaller nations caught between powerful adversaries and reshaped the global security landscape. The future of Europe, NATO, and the international system will be defined by the decisions made in the coming months and years. But one thing is clear: the world has changed, and it will never be the same. The question remains, will the future be one of peace and stability, or will the war in Ukraine serve as a harbinger of a more unstable, divided world?